Thank you so much for joining us today in this policy baraza, where we want to discuss the recently announced 2026 national budget. I think we all have a lot of questions around this new budget, and also there was quite a lot of issues that were raised. And from my readings, a majority of the issues, yes, health, etc., they were all allocated, but in terms of civil servants and their salaries, that's the first question and analysis that I got, that there is no package that is there for the workers, which is quite an alarming kind of like approach in terms of where then do we center them. And then also some of the introductions in terms of the taxes, the reductions of some, and then the increment in terms of the VAT tax by 0.5%, if I'm not mistaken. So I think we all need to have a thorough understanding of this new budget that has already been tabled in Parliament. And to help us in terms of unpacking this intriguing budget is Mr. Stevenson Dlamini, who is at the National University of Science and Technology, and also at the Ministry of Industry and Commerce, to try and really give us a leeway in terms of where do we stand, how are we affected, are there any loopholes in terms of us being able to benefit from this current national budget, what happens to some of the critical sectors such as your health, your education. I think it's quite important that we also get an appreciation of that. But I would also like to thank you for joining us, and also thank you to the PPRIZ team for organizing this, and also the PPRA team as well for giving us this venue, so that we can actually be able to have this discussion. I hope some of these seats are going to be filled in as people are coming in, but I think for now we can just get straight to business. I'll give the floor to Mr. Dlamini to come and unpack for us this national budget, with the hope that there is light at the end of the tunnel, in as much as we are going to be given the statistics, the percentages, the figures, but we hope somehow we'll find solace in some of those figures. Thank you so much. I think we can give him a round of applause.
Good afternoon, everyone. As has been said, my name is Stevenson Dlamini. I am an economist. I hail from the National University of Science and Technology, where I lecture applied economics as well as macro and microeconomics. I've been a lecturer there and a passionate economist for the past 17 years. And currently I am the acting deputy director in the Ministry of Industry and Commerce, Bulawayo Metropolitan Province. My duty today is to unpack the 2026 Zimbabwean national budget. I do not purport to report or present the budget. Just a disclaimer. But my purpose is to unpack it. Hence the title of my presentation. The title of my presentation is 2026 Budget Framework, an analysis of policy coherence and the strategy for structural resilience. I aim to separate tissue from tumor, do a diagnosis, give commendations, and end with a prescription for resilience. We all appreciate that the national budget is the single most honest document that a government produces each year, not because of what it says, but because of what it does. It is a binding allocation of scarce resources, and in that allocation we find the state's true soul. Today we are not here to praise or to bury the 2026 national budget. We are here to dissect it with the precision of a surgeon. We will separate tissue from tumor, like I said. We will identify the healthy, commendable signs of life. We will diagnose the deep structural pathologies that threaten the patient. And finally, we will prescribe the difficult but necessary course of treatment. So our analysis will be structured in 3 parts. We will identify the commendable signs of life, that is, the good parts, what we celebrate, the achievement and the successes, because professional analysis detects that you appreciate the good achievements that are in any document, and also then identify any impediments and give recommendations. That's a professional analysis. The picture that you see there is that of a hand trying to untangle a mesh of wires that are so entangled. This is the task that the Honorable Minister faces in Zimbabwe, to try and untangle and try to create a balance in this amongst the competing resources, competing wants and needs for the limited, scarce resource that we are faced with, trying to balance the policy trade-offs that present in public finance, at the same time trying to ensure that the integrity of sound financial management is maintained. Like I said, our analysis will be in 3 critical sessions. First, we want to acknowledge the brave, if tentative, steps towards orthodoxy and macroeconomic stability, which is the spirit behind the budget announcement, to try and ensure this macroeconomic stability and credibility through policy pronouncements. Under the commendations, under the commendations, yes, we would acknowledge there the condemnations will expose the structural sins and the intellectual contradictions that undermine the entire edifice. Then we will conclude by giving a clear, unsentimental prescription for a path towards genuine, sustainable recovery consistent with the dictates of NDS 2. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to start off by pointing out the successes, the consistent policy signals that signal to us that there is a drive towards stability, there is a spirit of trying to create macroeconomic stability. First of all, we appreciate the issue of formalization of legacy liabilities. Those of you who have institutional memory will recall the issue of quasi-fiscal operations that led to the 4-digit and higher levels of inflation at one point in time in our country, where we found the RBZ doing activities or financing activities that were otherwise meant for the fiscus. We see in the budget that there is a decision to hold the RBZ quasi-fiscal operations and transfer an amount of 2.247 billion in external liabilities to the Treasury's official balance sheet. This is a confession to say these are no longer lurking in the shadows. We are now embracing them as an official debt, and we are placing them where they rightfully should belong, under the fiscus. And this also supports the independence of the central bank. But of course, it does immediately increase the public debt to GDP ratio from the to 69.0. Some argue that it is 72.9 of present value of the GDP. This, of course, does present a significant challenge, but we appreciate and celebrate the transparency, the integrity to say, let's take it off the records of the RBZ and place it where it rightfully belongs, and we call it by its rightful name and not allow it to lurk as a phantom debt that continues to provide excruciating pain to the economic limbs. The anchor on macroeconomic stability also reflects in the budget. There's an action of the introduction of the ZIG. Still, we celebrate that, and we celebrate it because it has brought some measure of sustainability, of price stability and exchange rate stability ever since it regained its stability after the minor shock that it experienced. So the institutional objective is to sustain a single-digit inflation in 2026. This is clearly spelled out in the budget, and it is signaling the direction towards fiscal discipline, is signaling that the government is committed to ensuring that the objectives of the RBZ are complemented, which is that of ensuring a sustainable value of our local currency as we drive towards a monocurrency. The strategic link. This budget is supported by the medium-term debt strategy 2026 to 2030 and the arrears clearance and debt resolution roadmap. These underpin all these activities, all these allocations, which is targeting the international financial institutions clearance by 2027. It is clearly spelled out, the strategy has been put in place, how they will roll it out, and a commitment is made within the budget. We celebrate that there is a clear commitment to the multilateral and bilateral lenders that the government is committed to honoring its debt, and it has a strategy on how it will amortize the debt and ensure that we gain the credibility and a seat at the table with our multilateral lenders. This is an effort to get a seat so that we can talk with them, so that we can also attain a funding, which is very much needed. When it comes to prioritizing human capital development consistent with SDGs 2, 3, and 4, what we pick from the budget is that there's been a substantial allocation towards social services, such as education, which got 58.7 billion, which is a significant proportion of the allocation, health, 30.7 billion. I think it almost reaches the Abuja declaration of 15% of GDP being allocated to health. We celebrate that. Put together alongside with social protection, these amount to almost 50% of the budget allocation. This is a commendation. This is a good sign. There is also enhanced fiscal resilience and revenue outperformance that we find reflected in the 2026 budget announcement. Cumulative revenue collections from January to September 2025 amounting to 5.9 billion surpassed what was targeted, that is of 5.2 billion. We applaud that, representing a positive variance of 616.1 million in foreign currency terms. This sustained momentum strengthens domestic resource mobilization capabilities. It is a commendation. There is also, when we look at issues of climate finance, or how the targeted climate resilient capital investment consistent with SDG 13. In the budget, we find that 1.8 billion ZIG is explicitly set aside for climate adaptation and mitigation, including 873.6 million for dam construction and 823.8 million for irrigation development. This is supporting the SDGs. This addresses climate change as a structural economic threat. We applaud that in the budget. Excuse me. When it comes to gender sensitivity, what we pick from the budget and the issues of financial inclusion, we realize that the Ministry of Women Affairs was allocated 1.1 billion, including 152 million for Women's Microfinance Bank. This is reflecting gender sensitivity. 70.4 million for Women Development Fund, explicitly targeting empowerment and SME development. We applaud that within the budget. Allocation towards basic education and arrears clearance. We know a lot of money is being owed to BIM. As 5.6 billion was specifically allocated for the basic education assistance module. This is consistent with the SDGs, inclusive of arrears clearance. And this demonstrates a commitment to maintaining equitable access to education, especially for the vulnerable children who had challenges in accessing resources to fund their education. We are looking at the plausible parts, signs of life in our patient. Strengthening foreign exchange reserves. In the budget, we note that total gold and foreign reserves increased to approximately $950 million by end of October 2025, which represents over 1 month import bill cover. This fiscal backing is critical for sustaining market confidence and sustaining the value of our ZIG. Now, for our condemnations, now we have celebrated the wins, the good parts in the budget, but like any other budget, it is with its own challenges that we have identified, that we are now separating from the wins. The first hurdle that we pick and note as a challenge in the budget is that the projected positive economic growth of 5%, which is largely one of the highest in the SADC projected for the coming year, 5% growth, runs the risk of being vulnerable because it is premised predominantly on commodity prices surging. It is premised on consumptive trade, as you later on see that wholesale and retail have been the largest contributors to the GDP, which is a consumptive behavior or consumptive expenditure which is not quite sustainable. It is also driven by agriculture, which is highly reliant on weather. So this is also at the backdrop of a low manufacturing capacity utilization, which is pegged at 47.7% for the first quarter of 2025. This reflects that the ground is not very stable. It's a bit volatile. What we need, the main driver of sustainable economic growth is the manufacturing sector, where there is value creation, not consumptive or transactive expenditure. So this vulnerability on its own is what then we worry about in the budget. This vulnerability is also exacerbated by uncompetitive pressure on our local industries, which goes on to undermine the sustainability of the economic growth, which must be inclusive. So we appreciate that there are efforts underway to adjust customs duty reflected in the budget. The local textile industry, which we appreciate, has had a lot of challenges, with the workforce declining from 35,000 to just about 6.8 workers, primarily due to the threat of the influx of cheap finished garments that evade up to 120 million in annual duty revenue. These represent an opportunity cost because they come in through smuggling and other under-invoicing that compromise the government of significant revenue. The policies that we note is that the policy that target input tariffs do not address the fundamental breach of market integrity, which is the infiltration of cheaper finished goods into the market. These smuggled goods, these smuggled garments cannot be addressed by a duty on garments that has been levied at about 40% plus $2.50 a kg on selected fabrics. This would undermine the competitiveness of our clothing and textile industry, which is already struggling to get back on its feet and compete not only locally but regionally. We appreciate some of the players have been making inroads even into the regional markets, such as in Malawi. So our worry is that the policy does not directly address the threat to market integrity, the breach to market integrity, which is the infiltration of cheaper clothing or second-hand garments. The second condemnation speaks to refinancing risk and the domestic arrears overhang. The budget is underpinned, like I said, by the medium-term debt strategy, as well as the arrears clearance strategy, the expenditure and arrears clearance strategy. We appreciate that this formal recognition of the legacy debt is a positive, because it encourages the independence of the central bank. But the resultant debt overhang has actually rendered our debt carrying capacity officially weak. By refinancing this risk, 45.4% of total debt, which is going to mature within a year, it now has transferred the problem of quasi-fiscal operations into a fiscal strain. It will create a fiscal stress because now the Treasury has to assume the debt overhang, and that increases the proportion of debt to GDP in our country, which stands above 70%, way above the 30% recommended threshold. The implications of the refinancing, especially of the domestic debt, it can be viewed through the lenses of what we term involuntary lending. This large stock of arrears compromises the credibility of the budget and acts as a hidden tax, forcing suppliers, particularly those who are owed for large capital projects like dams and roads, to provide the government with involuntary interest-free financing. The refinancing has actually restructured the debt into instruments that are redeemable after 5 years and only redeemable at a discount before the 5 years, but they are non-tradable instruments. This is the refinancing that we are saying it is creating a bottleneck and eroding the trust from the private sector in government contracts. There's also contingent liability risk. It has been identified by the IMF through the staff program that there is a need to strengthen governance, including robust reporting, audit, disclosure, and oversight of the Mutapa Investment Fund. This is a signal from the lenders that their worry is that there may be a quasi-fiscal activity that may result from that institution. But they are calling for increased transparency, increased governance of the fund. This is a signal from the multilateral institutions whose goodwill we are seeking through the debt restructuring efforts, through the medium-term debt strategy. We require their goodwill, and this is the advice that they proffer for us to regain their goodwill. Still within the policy, we realize there is a policy trade-off in the revenue mobilization. In the good spirit of domestic resource mobilization, the government introduced the IMTT. And the reform, which has seen a reduction of 0.5 basis points, on the local IMTT and the retaining of the 2% intermediate monetary transfer tax. We acknowledge that this is one of the significant revenue generators for the government, as acknowledged in the budget, that it surpassed its targets for the period that it was identified there. Our worry is that IMTT is taxing the velocity of circulation instead of taxing value. The challenge is that when you tax velocity of circulation, you are taxing the medium of exchange. You are essentially incentivizing the formalized institutions to go into the shadow economy. Because when you tax a transaction, when you are taxing a velocity of circulation, you are discouraging the creation of formalization, which is what the government is trying to drive, increase in formalization. So this preference, this revenue collection necessity is coming at the expense of financial inclusion. We are driving people into the cash economy. We're moving them away from the formal banking systems as they try to avoid the digital taxes. But this is also reversing the gains of financial inclusion that we had realized as a country so far. Also taxing the USD withdrawals above $1,001 would risk also undermining the intermediation functions of the banks. It has a risk of moving physical foreign currency out of the formal banking system into private hoarding, which will further undermine the banking sector's capacity to intermediate in the critical foreign exchange that we so much need as a country. But they say there is no statue that was ever erected for a critic. Hence, we propose a bridge, a recommendation of a stone-strong arc bridge for our policy to improve and create a resilient macroeconomy that is stable. The first recommendation that I make relates to the prioritization of immediate liquidity restoration for the domestic economy. I know some critics will say this is a risk of creating an inflationary environment. The action that we recommend is that we accelerate the audit and validation of the 45.6 billion domestic expenditure areas that have not been validated. In the budget, there is 45.6 billion domestic expenditure areas that are not yet validated, and implement an expenditures and areas clearance strategy with greater urgency. It's reflected within the budget. We encourage that because this is creating a huge debt overhang. The impact of this action is that while the conversion of arrears into 5-year non-tradable securities is meant to be a mechanism for solvency, faster clearance of high priority categories, especially those affecting social welfare such as BIM and compensation, is essential to restore private sector liquidity, to rebuild contractual trust, and immediately reduce the domestic credit premium. Because by virtue of not honoring these, we are increasing the country's risk premium, which increases our cost of borrowing from other multilateral and bilateral institutions. But we need to de-risk the country by addressing these urgently. This will also create, it will unlock a lot of value within the private sector, which will drive growth. The second recommendation is enforce market integrity and revenue metamorphosis. The recommendation is that announce a credible multi-year plan to phase out the distortionary transaction taxes like the IMTT. Let there be a clear roadmap on the way forward and how it will eventually be replaced. and replace this revenue by implementing policies that tax verifiable production and profit. Profit is an opinion. Taxing an opinion does not yield much change, much development. What we are experiencing with transactional taxes is that they are reversing the Laffer curve. And as a nation, when we reverse the Laffer curve, where Laffer told us that the higher taxes create a disincentive for people to be productive, we are actually going higher on the taxes. And what is also important to note is that when it comes to taxes, it's not about how much the taxes are, it's about how the taxes are implemented. The impact of this announcement will critically address the revenue leakages that cripple formal industries. This requires radical enforcement against customs duty evasion on finished garments. These are the greatest threat to market integrity in the textiles and clothing industry. And the stricter utilization of tools like quoted price method for mineral pricing. We have a lot of leakages as well in the minerals sector that if they were closed, they would ring fence more revenue for the government. So this would be to ensure fiscus captures a fair share of commodity booms and formal domestic industry can compete fairly against untaxed imports. Currently, the 10% increase on royalties for minerals runs the risk of profiteering the black market. It will push the formal market into the shadow economy, where they will go and enjoy that 10% premium, the benefits of that 10% premium, while we forego the benefits of the price booms that will occur in the minerals and commodities market. So we need to be very careful in plugging the leakages that are in that industry. Institutional safeguards and transparency. The action uphold the medium-term debt strategy commitment to the arrears clearance and debt resolution roadmap. This is a signal we are sending to the global investors beyond the multilateral institutions, beyond the Paris Club and the IMF and the World Bank. This is a signal we are showing to the world and the global investors that we are committed to re-engagement and is contingent upon institutional reforms, including consolidating constitutionalism, the rule of law, and protecting property rights. These are already in place and just need to be spread and publicized. The impact of this would be to immediately implement the IMF's recommendations for the investment fund, consistent with the roadmap. Let's respond to the signals that they are giving us. Subject to transparent reporting, audit, disclosure, and oversight to permanently close avenues for quasi-fiscal operations, thereby safeguarding the credibility of the ZIG and demonstrating fiscal prudence to international partners. This is all underpinned by the commitment to upholding the MTDS as well as the arrears clearance and debt resolution roadmap. As we conclude, the choice is ours to either be architects or wardens. The 2026 budget, national budget, confirms a strategic choice to manage the economy based on disciplined metrics. However, the path to durable prosperity requires addressing deep-seated structural issues, as is advocated for in NDS2, economic structural reforms. The domestic debt overhang, the incentives for informality need to be reduced, and the vulnerabilities to the productive sector need to be addressed, the archaic machineries, the high cost that has already been taken care of, but we need to ensure that we boost productivity in the manufacturing sector as well. Success will be measured not merely by budget compliance, but by the tangible realignment of incentives that transforms economic participants from operating in the shadows, that is the informal economy, to thriving in a formalized, competitive economy. The challenge remains the one of maintaining institutional integrity to ensure that proclaimed policies translates into sustained national confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit the budget is a lot, but I chose to just pick on these key highlights to share with you. Thank you.